This is the i5-6600 processor. The actual CPU looks like this. It fits into a socket 1151, typically with a Z170 chipset. Basically, this is your highest non-K i5 processor. Its base frequency is 3.3 GHz and it can turbo up to 3.9. This is Easy Gamer's recommendation for a medium budget gaming PC. If you're not looking to do some serious overclocking or building a beast of a computer and just want to be able to play most games, this is an excellent place to start. Basically what it is it's a 65 watt TDP processor. Now, to explain what TDP is that's basically how Intel determines the power consumption and therefore the actual amount of performance you can get from the CPU. Now, this can be very confusing because a lot of people look at processors and say, okay, it's an i5 or it's an i7. In reality, that's really a very small factor on the performance. To put it in perspective for you, the amount of processing power to the amount of energy stays relatively consistent in the same generation. But where this 6600 is an i5, you can get an i7-6600U, which is the typical i7 you'd find in a laptop, and that's only a 15 watt processor compared to this 165. So you have a lot less actual processing power. Then if you take it a step up, you can get a 6700HQ, which is also a laptop processor, but a 45 watt processor, which is, if you look at it just quickly in the store, they'll both just have an i7 sticker on, but the reality is the one is 3 times the performance of the next one. If you want to take a step up from this, the 6700K is a 91 watt processor, which is a nice big leap, and then the next step up, which we can explain in a bit of a different video, is the 140 watt processors, and they fall into a completely different socket. They have quad channel RAM instead of the dual channel which you would find on this or the lower processors, and but it's a much more expensive build, but you do get more performance with them. So back to this one. Typical actual performance, actual power consumption is at idle, you're looking at 3.8 watt. During gaming, measured gaming usage is about 52 watt. So it doesn't actually draw that much power, but it's definitely significantly more than what you would get from a laptop processor, hence the reason for actually going the desktop route. But this is a 14 nanometer processor still, which is the technology used for the manufacturing, which means it's incredibly power efficient. So even though you're looking at more than a factor 4 of a typical laptop i7, your CPU cooler, which you would get with it, is actually quite a small little cooler, and in our experience it's actually sufficient if you're not going into overclocking. If you want to go a step up to the 6700K, then you can look at a better cooler, because as you overclock you start to lose efficiency and generate more heat. The processor comes with fairly impressive onboard graphics. It's the HD Gaming 530. If you're looking just for a good place to start and don't want to buy graphics cards immediately, it's an excellent option. You can play most games at D1080, but unfortunately with all the settings set to low. But we've tested it, it's fairly playable. You can look elsewhere in the section, you'd find a video on what it's actually like to use the 530 for gaming on an HD screen. Basically, if you're looking in terms of where would you place the CPU, in overall CPU benchmarks, this is normally in the 83rd percentile, which means it's quite good. But if you're looking just at quad-core benchmarks, this is actually in the 96th percentile, which means there's very few quad-core processors that are actually quicker than this. So it's a great value for money processor. The difference between this and the i7, the 6700, is basically hyperthreading and the slight clock speed, but very little. And what hyperthreading is a lot of people has the misconception that it's actually extra cores. It's not. This is a quad-core processor, whereas the i7 one is a quad core with hyper-threading. So Windows sees it as 8 processing cores, but all it actually is each processing core has 2 feeds into it. And for certain tasks, such as video encoding, you gain a little bit out of that, but for gaming there's virtually no difference. So there's not really extra value to go for the hyper-threading versus not hyper-threading if you're targeting gaming. Basically, summary of this processor: good value, great performance when you compare it to something like the laptop i7s, and overall, until you're looking at 4K gaming, probably more than you'd need in terms of processing power.